So good morning, ladies and gentlemen, on this crisp, lovely New York winter fall day. My name is Alexander Cooley. I am Deputy Director for Social Science Programming here at the Harriman Institute, also a Professor of Political Science at Barnard College. And it is just my great pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural Harriman EURASIANET forum in collaboration with EURASIANET and Justin Burke, managing editor. The original impetus behind this event was to really put our heads together, our networks together, and some of our resources together to think about some of these emerging challenges that have hit the region. And our idea for the forum predates what happened in Ukraine, but became even more timely given events in Ukraine. And I would say that EURASIANET and Harriman share a number of, I think, common missions and common philosophies. Even though Harriman is a regional studies institute, EURASIANET is a reporting and media outlet. And the first of them really is a commitment to covering all sorts of angles and all sorts of aspects of the political, social, economic, and legal developments in the region. Justin can speak more about EURASIANET and its origins, but one of the goals of its founders was to cover events in Central Asia and the Caucasus that were not necessarily related to energy or compelling U.S. security interests, to try and find a voice and an outlet that wouldn't exist in the regular media outlet to document the stories that were changing the region in a social and political way. And at Harriman, as many of you know, we're the country's oldest regional institute devoted to the study of the former Soviet Union, formerly the Russia Institute. We hold about 150 events a year. Perhaps we hold too many events a year, but none are more important than this. And we also feel compelled to cover both current affairs type issues, new issues, as well as offer outlets for the scholars and the analysts who are very specialized in the region, who work on 1960s and 1970s education in Kyrgyzstan, for instance, and want to have an outlet for their work and their scholarships. So we're not a think tank. Even though sometimes we put on think tank-like events, we're very concerned with identifying new trends. We feel at the core of our mission is an educational mission across a broad range of issues. I think the second thing that we have in common is a commitment to tackling tough issues. And I think there's no tougher issue at the moment. It's absolutely fascinating from an analytical point of view, but also a compelling policy challenge to deal with this issue of this new emerging media space, which is the topic, the theme of our conference today. I think there's been lots of interesting high-profile publications, reports. A recent one has referred to the weaponization of information by the Kremlin. Others have responded and said, look, this isn't the weaponization of information by the Kremlin, this is just the next evolution of the global media environment. This is a now multipolar media space, right, where it's no longer the Western media that dominates the airwaves in the world in the post-Soviet space. And what we're seeing with the expansion of outlets like RT, other sort of information outlets, is the creation of multiple poles, multiple centers for global media. So that's one of the issues I think we want to try and get a handle on today. How exactly should we view these developments? What language should we use? What vocabulary should we use to describe them? Is it unprecedented, or is it just the natural evolution of things? And what can the coverage of the Ukraine crisis and its discursive effects tell us about the future media environment? Then I think the third common issue that, or common perspective that we share is a commitment to the region and studying the region as a region. And often we're asked, Harriman Institute covers everything from Prague to Dushanbe. What in the world does this space have in common anymore? Right? And I think it's a perfectly valid question, and I'm not sure I have a very good answer to that specific question. But it's a question that we grapple with and that we try and deal with in our programming. But my first, really my main answer would be we deal with this region as a region because the members, the political elites, actors, social movements within the region keep very close tabs on what's going on in their neighborhood, right? You have a lot of emulative effects. You have governments who are concerned about developments in neighboring countries. You have demonstration effects, right? So when a color revolution displaces a government in one Eurasian capital, other governments are concerned. As well as trends, social trends, media laws, NGO laws. And I think the fabric of the region might not be there in terms of statistics like, formal trade, which actually in Central Asia is very low. This is one of the most trade-unfriendly parts of the world. But the concern about what's going on in the neighborhood is very high. And I think both in our programming and I think in EURASIANET's coverage, how the region itself is being impacted by Ukraine and reactions to Ukraine is a big topic. And I think that's reflected in the bios and expertise of some of our panelists on the first panel. So Nabi Abdullaev's publication, the Moscow Times, really looks at a lot of regional trends, both within Central Asia, relations with China, relations with Europe, that's a focus. Andrei Soldatov currently will be talking about information, but his previous work looking at security services in the region and how the security services of Russia networked with other post-Soviet countries. And Bruce Pannier at RFERL runs now what's a very interesting, successful blog on the region as a region in Central Asia and so forth. And then in our second panel, we're going to look at the question of the regional impact in Central Asia of the current events. And we'll look at it from the economic point of view, from the political point of view, from the freedom of expression point of view. But just to give you sort of just a taste of some of the dilemmas of some of the leaders, if you're a Central Asian ruler and you see the Maidan movement happening and the events of the annexation of Crimea and eastern Ukraine, there are multiple alarm bells ringing. And you have to think, what do you fear most? Do you fear most a similar Maidan street movement, right, that sort of topples you? Or do you fear the appearance of the so-called little green men, right, especially if your country hosts a Russian military facility that's operating on a long-term lease? Right, so there are a number of concerns, and given the demonstration effects of this very powerful media space after the Crimean annexation, I think that's also a very powerful message that was sent, especially the Central Asian countries where Russian language media is still very powerful. So it all ties together. We're really excited that you're here. Just a reminder to everyone that the session is on the record. We're going to videotape it, digitally archive it, disseminate it, and so forth. So you too will be part of history if you talk. And without further ado, I want to introduce my partner in this, Justin Burke, who is managing editor of EURASIANET. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, Alex, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the event. As Alex mentioned, I'm Justin Burke, managing editor of EURASIANET, which is affiliated with the Open Society Foundations here in New York. We've been operating since 1999, and as Alex mentioned, our goal is to basically fill niches that are left unfilled by mainstream media coverage. And I'm proud of the job that we have done. Now, I'm going to start off my remarks with a story, since I'm a journalist. And I had the good fortune of being a Moscow correspondent in the early 1990s during the end of the communist era. And I was in Moscow for the August 1991 coup, communism's last gasp. And I think the moment that encapsulated the end of the Cold War was the moment when a crowd dismantled the statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky on Lubyanka Square, right in front of the KGB headquarters. It took a while for that to happen, and I remember watching as the crowd were trying to fix steel cables around Iron Felix. And I was wondering, okay, communism's dead. What comes next? And finally, they toppled Felix, and he was swinging in the cables, and it was an exhilarating moment. And in that moment, it was easy to think that Western values, democracy, namely democracy and market economics, had smooth sailing, that it would have no problem taking root in the former Soviet Union. One political scientist famously even proclaimed the end of history. And boy, were those assumptions wrong. Very quickly, of course, market economics and democracy became associated with the chaos involved with Russia's and the former Soviet Union's transition, and then they became dirty words. So that was one strike against Western values. Then, of course, at the turn of the millennium, we had the surge in oil prices, and that enabled Vladimir Putin to rebuild Russia and put into place an authoritarian system that he dubbed early on managed democracy. Well, you know, over time, what Putin managed to do was set up his authoritarian system as a plausible alternative to Western values and a representative form of government. And in the last couple of years, of course, and especially this year after the Ukraine, especially the Crimean annexation, the pendulum has swung all the way back in the other direction. I was in September in the Baltic states at a conference, and the president of Estonia at that conference warned that we are in danger, Europe is in danger of returning to a Hobbesian state of nature. So, quarter century ago, we were contemplating the end of history, and now we're going back to a state of nature. Now, of course, such a characterization is definitely an exaggeration. But it's not really a stretch to say that a culture war of sorts is at hand, one where you have Western values and a Russian alternative, almost an anti-Western model. And it's fair to say that Western style values are facing perhaps their most serious philosophical challenge since the 1930s. It's arguable, but you can say that right now. What is definitely the case is that Putinism has upended the European order established under the Helsinki Final Act of 1975. That we see plainly evident. And it's not just that authoritarianism is taking hold across the former Soviet states, it's even manifesting itself in the European Union. You see the rise of far-right parties across the European Union, and of course you have the example of Hungary, which is drifting at a fairly rapid rate in the direction of a strong presidential system. So the question is what comes next, and no one can be sure about that. With the Russian economy starting to buckle, we could be in for a very bumpy ride in 2015 and beyond. One thing is for sure, the United States and the European Union really can't stand pat and expect Western values to win the day. There has to be a new marketing campaign, one that better explains how democracy and market economics offer the best chance for any given society to build stability and prosperity. And that's why we are here today. We want to gain a more detailed picture of what's going on in Russia and the broader region, with the hope that a better understanding of the conditions over there will help foster dialogue and debate here about how to respond, how to freshen up the brand, so to speak. So our first panel today is going to focus on mass media and its role in pushing Putin's agenda, the alternative to a Western value system, and its effectiveness. Now, whereas nuclear missiles defined the Cold War, as Alex mentioned in his remarks, mass media has so far been the chief weapon of Putin's budding culture war. So it's very important to understand how mass media is acting across the former Soviet Union. So joining me today are three distinguished experts on this issue. We have Nabi Abdullaev, who is the editor-in-chief of the Moscow Times, and also Andrei Soldatov, who runs Agentura.ru, a news website devoted to security-related issues in Russia and press freedom and free speech. And then Bruce Pannier, of a longtime Central Asia expert at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. So the structure of this panel will be, we have, each panelist will talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions. So without further delay, I give the floor to Nabi. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Are they on? I want to start with a banal proverb. I think that the situation in Russia, as elsewhere and anytime, is not as bad as you fear, and is not as good as you hope. And building on it, I want to continue the idea that was just pronounced by Justin, that we are witnessing the clash of values. I am also a graduate of a policy school, and also like all these models in which one system confronts another, and they try to find ways of how to successfully utilize their resources in order to achieve certain results. What is going on with the Russian media, I think, is a strong manifestation that there is no such system as Putinism. The biggest problem of Russia and of Putin is that over 15 years, it has not produced the vision of the future country. Like in the States, you have this city on the hill, a shining city on the hill. Yeah. Most Eastern European countries, they knew what they want to build, and they had the vision of the future. Even Georgia Saakashvili had the vision of the country he wants to build. Putin has not provided any vision in this sense. We don't know whether he wants to build a liberal democracy. Most probably no. Illiberal democracy? No. Illiberal non-democracy? Still, there are lots of liberal and democratic things in Russia that he could have eliminated easily and without any cost to his political career. Let's look at the media. For example, the latest media law that was pushed through the Duma in just 9 days that limits foreign ownership of the media in Russia. And everyone says that it targets few remaining free and quality media organizations such as Vedomosti, which is owned jointly by Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and Sanoma Independent magazines, the Finnish company, or Forbes, that is owned in Russia by Axel Springer. Russian Forbes is one of the best publications along with Vedomosti. But in the meantime, what the authorities could do, they could issue a couple of warnings for extremism and then shut these publications just within 3 days. And they don't do this. Given how client is the Russian court system. I mean, both Vedomosti and Forbes was sued by one of the Putin's dons, head of Rosneft, Sechin, recently, and they were actually, they lost their cases. One was the libel case in which Sechin sued Vedomosti for telling, for writing that he can influence government decisions. Yeah, and Vedomosti lost it. And Forbes was sued for saying that Sechin is being paid $50 million a year salary as the CEO of Rosneft. And Forbes also lost it. But Sechin could have slapped them with payments, say like $10 million, and the courts would uphold it, and these publications would be ruined. And this is not happening. It's a kind of strange game going on in Russia. It's not that like straightforward. And this law, for example, it also can be directed against one of like close Putin allies in the oligarchic elite, like Abramovich, who owns shares in Channel One, or Putin's friends Kovalchuks and Rothenbergs, who also own Channel One shares more than 20% through a number of offshore companies. So it's a really strange move, and I mean, if Putin wanted to deal with the free media quickly, he could have done it easily, but this is not happening. I don't mean that he is the champion of the freedom of the press, but I think that there are many motivations. The game is more complex than it seems from the first sight. Same is true when we speak about the biggest phenomenon that is happening in the Russian media is the rise of the propaganda, state propaganda, the rise of the Sputnik news and the increase of like the boost that Russia Today got, and actually the active boost of the presence of the state propagandists in the social networks. Yes, I used to work for RIA Novosti, which was the state-owned news organization, for 3 years, and I headed the foreign language news service there. I walked out exactly 1 year ago when Putin announced the revamp of RIA Novosti and turning into Россия сегодня, and gave it to the most famous Russian propagandist Dmitry Kiselev. He appointed him the head of it. Was it a move that would help achieve the proposed goal of projecting positive Russia's image abroad? Definitely no, because with the appointment of Kiselev, it's immediately put the Russia Today in the situation whatever they produce is being seen as pure propaganda. And the thing with propaganda, I mean, if you see it as a propaganda, people believe it is propaganda, and it doesn't work. It doesn't influence decision making in the countries that have targeted audiences. And the ways, the strategies that were chosen the operational strategies chosen by Russia Today and Россия сегодня also speak against the existence of such model as Putinism. They do not project any positive image of Russia, maybe because there is no one. It's not about nothing good happening in Russia. It's about the lack of the vision that these propaganda juggernauts have to project. Instead, they use to attack the Western values. It's mainly like poisoning, attacking, questioning all the Western values without providing the alternative. That's the meaning of and the purpose of this propaganda machine. Does it work? Sometimes, yes. Russia Today boasts having the biggest number of, the biggest audience in both Americas. They say it's about 400 million people. Actually, it's the number of subscribers to the cable packages, which include Russia Today. Yeah, and it doesn't mean that like each subscriber watches Russia Today, but but they do report some success. For example, their YouTube channel hit 1 billion views, which is actually the biggest ever YouTube channel in the world. Yeah, people watch it. But to what extent it works in influencing policy making and decision making in the targeted countries, it's a big question. I run a very small news organization. It's only 27 people. It's called the Moscow Times. If you go to Google and type Russian news, the Moscow Times comes first, and Russia Today comes third, despite the fact that their budget is 200 times bigger than mine. Yeah. I don't know exactly how Google rankings work, but I want to believe that it's the quality of information. I mean, it's kind of peer recognition. It's information being shared and being quoted allows me to stay above them in the Google rankings. And there is, yesterday I spoke at the Columbia School of Journalism, and one girl said that, you know how it's dangerous to report in Russia and to be a journalist in Russia, and we had a very short argument with her. I said it's not dangerous, because despite whatever vision of Russia is, despite the facts that Russia is like quite low on the media freedom rankings, you don't find journalists with slit throats in the ditch in Russia quite often. Actually, I don't remember any. Well, there was a single big reported incident when the chief editor of a Pskov newspaper was beaten after he reported about Russian soldiers being flown in their bodies after they were killed during the Ukrainian on the Ukrainian soil. But what I want to say is that despite the pressure, despite all this attitude, negative attitude that the government produces, not despite, in addition to it, there is another big problem. There is no strong public demand for quality journalism. These crackdowns, they do not generate public outrage. There are few quality news publications in Russia, which is Vedomosti, Forbes, RBK, and the joint audience is maybe 3-5 million maximum. For the country of 140 million, it's not much. But even this small audience does not produce enough public demand, not only, I mean, freedom-wise, but also market-wise, because all these publications are struggling and maybe breaking even. None of them is, it's actually a global trend everywhere. I will be happy to answer more questions later if you have them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Andrei?
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me here. Well, I would talk about why Russian propaganda is so effective, because of course it's effective, especially inside of Russia, given that more than 84% of...
Today, 82.
82, okay. Support Vladimir Putin's actions in Ukraine. Well, I think the problem is, but we need to remember one thing about this 82-85%, which is these numbers shows that Vladimir Putin's policy is supported not only by regions or by provincial population living in small towns with some crazy ideas about the glorious Soviet past, etc., etc. The problem is that Vladimir Putin's policy now, also in Ukraine, is supported by the middle classes, by people who actually live in big cities, who can speak English, who can compare things, who, if they want to, they can find access to information even in English, not to say to find this information in Russian. They all have access to the internet, they are all present in social media, but nevertheless, many of them decided to support Vladimir Putin's policy, especially in Ukraine. And there should be some answers to that. And I think the problem is that maybe this support might be explained by three main reasons. The first one is that the middle classes in Russia, which became so important factor maybe in the early mid of 2000s, actually with the middle classes, what you can see everywhere, they're mostly concerned about the security. And that helped the Kremlin to sell many of repressive legislation. For example, the legislation on the internet, all these things about the filtering of the internet was sold to the middle classes under pretext that we need to protect your children. And the middle classes were happy to accept this idea. When we got the protests in Moscow in 2011 and in 2012, the Kremlin played with the fear of the middle classes of a revolution. That somehow we can repeat the 1917 disaster revolution of Bolsheviks, etc. And I remember this very well. I was present at the biggest manifestations, the biggest protest on the Sakharov Street in December of 2011. And I well remember how Navalny made his claim, something like, now we are so strong we even can go to the Kremlin. And I remember how people around me literally stepped back because of this fear that it might lead to some sort of bloody revolution. And the Kremlin played with this idea. The Kremlin always portrayed the Arab Spring as something which might happen in Moscow. When we got Maidan, the Kremlin's propaganda again played with this fear that, guys, maybe you are not happy with Putin, but do you really need this kind of bloody Maidan happening on your streets? And many of those who actually supported Navalny decided, in this case, to support Vladimir Putin just because we wanted stability, just because they feared this ghost of a revolution. That was the first thing. The second thing is, of course, the idea of the legacy of the Second World War, which is still very important for Russia, because actually it's the only thing which unites all of us. And I'm talking not only about Russia, but also about the former Soviet Union. And in every family you can find someone who was killed or who fought during the war. And because the Soviet propaganda, not only the Russian propaganda, but the Soviet propaganda, starting maybe from the 60s, exploited this idea of the legacy of the Second World War as the main idea which unites all of us. Because, well, communism was irrelevant already by maybe 1950s. Everybody remember, and I think the best example is Solzhenitsyn's novel, The First Cycle, but people actually forgot about communism by the end of the war. And they tried with, and Stalin himself tried to reinvent the Russian Empire with all this symbolism and separate schools for men and for women and for girls and etc. So it's this idea of finding some sort of uniting idea on the basis of the sufferings during the war was very sound for our parents, and it's still sound for the middle classes. Because also, it's a bridge to the third and the most important point. It is a point about the grievance against the West. It's extremely important because this feeling is shared not only by, say, engineers who lost their job because the military-industrial complex suffered some cuts in the 1990s, but also by the middle classes. I think the very first time that we see this connection between the grievance against the West and the middle classes became more and more patriotic and supportive to the Kremlin was in 1998. We got the crisis, the economic crisis in 1998. We already had some sort of middle classes, all westernized, with all ideas that we can very easily become some sort of the United States, maybe France, maybe Britain. And then all of a sudden we got the crisis and, well, everything was just destroyed. People felt betrayed, but they didn't know how to channel this feeling of betrayal. And then we got 1999 and the bombings of Belgrade. And that was the way how the Kremlin found the first time how to channel this aggression, this feeling of grievance. And I well remember when, because I wrote about these things in Izvestia in 1999 and 2000, how the middle classes became more and more, well, aggressive against the West. But you see Belgrade bombings is just another example, another sign of hypocrisy of the West. We are betrayed by the West. We were promised a lot, we got nothing. And I think that was a moment when the Kremlin understood that the best thing to increase support for the Kremlin's policy is to point a finger to the West. The next thing, what I think the next good example of this strategy was shown in 2008 when we got the Georgia war. If you look into the Russian coverage of the Georgian war, I should say that nobody actually cared to say try to find some evidence of atrocities committed by Georgian troops. Nobody cared about Georgians, nobody cared about the North Ossetians. The main point for the Russian propaganda then was to show how bad, incompetent, and hypocritical was the Western coverage of the war. And that was the important point. When we got the Ukrainian crisis, again, nobody cared about Crimea, well, before February, except the famous Moscow mayor, Yuri Lushkov, who actually was the only one guy on the federal level who cared about Crimea for 20 years. Nobody cared about Crimea until February, when we got Crimea. And again, the whole thing was portrayed by the media not as the fighting for, say, get something on Ukraine, but it's a combination of all these three factors. But first, the Kremlin saved us from a ghost of a revolution. Second is that in Ukraine we can see fascists straight back from the Second World War. And the next thing, that it's all about conspiracy of the West. And when we get this combination, the middle classes easily buy these things. And and now maybe we need to find some answers to why the middle classes became so easily manipulated. I think one of the problems is the problem of the media. I think Nabi is absolutely right saying that we don't see a huge demand for quality media shown even by the middle classes. The circulation of quality dailies like Vedomosti or Kommersant, I can't say that we actually raised it during the 2000s, despite the increase in the numbers of the middle classes. It was a pact between the Kremlin and the middle classes, where the middle classes traded off public freedoms for private freedoms. We got these private freedoms, we got very low-level taxes, we got the apartments, the cars, the trips abroad, etc., etc. But in return, we just forget about politics completely. We just forget how to think politically. And what we got as a result, we got a very simplistic picture of what's going on around us. And that was, again, played by the Kremlin propaganda because and what you see now, it's a very emotional and simplistic approach to news. It's a very human stories. It's not about policy. It's about, well, some children are crucified by Ukrainian fascists. That was, I think, might be the most circulated, the most popular story in social media. And that leads me to the last point, to the role of social media. I think it's extremely important because, and I think now with Ukraine, we got something unexpected, completely unexpected by experts, especially by cybersecurity experts. We all believed during, well, maybe in February and March, that some huge DDoS attacks are imminent against Ukrainian websites because we think that, well, remember the story of Estonians, of how Estonia was attacked in 2007, how Georgia was attacked in 2008, blah, blah, blah. So it happens all the time. So we expected something to happen similar to happen now. It never happened. Actually, the Russian propaganda, Russian hackers, they never tried to hit hardly Ukrainian websites. Instead, we got propaganda, Russian propaganda on social networks. And that provokes Ukrainians to make some crazy mistakes. Like now we are talking about censoring of social media. And in turn, it provokes the Kremlin to say, well, these Ukrainians, you liberal intelligence, try to say us that these Ukrainians are on the way to liberal Europe, but actually we are talking about censorship. So we are not so different from us. We are all the same. And that helps the Kremlin to improve and to build this basis for support inside of the country and outside, because the problem is that this kind of feelings of grievance against the West, of this legacy of the Second World War, is shared not only by Russians who live in Russia, but also by people in the former Soviet Union. And partly it's also true for the Eastern Europe. If you talk now in Prague, in Budapest, in Warsaw, well, you can get this feeling that people are not very happy with these failed promises made by the West. We have some ideas about these promises, but we have this strong feeling that that they were betrayed. They were promised something and we got almost nothing. And I think, well, obviously, it was not Putin who actually constructed this thing. So he's not such a good politician to construct something new and to exploit it. He just used something which already was there. He just fills the gap. And that's why tactically he's so good.
All right, thank you, Andrei. Now, Bruce will present a view of how Russian propaganda is working in Central Asia.
Thank you. Thanks to EURASIANET for inviting me, and thanks to Columbia University and Harriman Institute for hosting the event. It's good to be back here again. You've already heard I'm from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and I've been doing Central Asia for a while now. As far as Central Asia's media environment is concerned, Russia is the dominant foreign media source. In great part that it's due to that colonial thing. And what I'm going to say next is obvious, but I have to say it at the start to get the clear picture of the media climate in Central Asia right now and for the foreseeable future. Russia's relationship to its former colonies in Central Asia is different than Britain or France's relationships to their foreign colonies. The language connection, that is the former colonizer, is there in all three examples. The sun still doesn't set on BBC broadcasts across the world to people who can understand the language very easily. French media is not very far behind it. Russian language broadcasts don't have such wide dissemination, but we're talking about the Eurasian space, and within that territory, Russian language broadcasting is still popular. And I'll be returning to this point in a second. Britain and France have overseas colonies, but you can't hop on a train and get to Britain or France in a couple of days, whereas in Russia, as we know, thousands of people are arriving there every day on buses and trains. So in Central Asia, there are people over 35 years old who would know Russian from childhood, and there's hundreds of thousands of people from the under 35 generation who have gone to Russia as migrant laborers and been exposed to the language. Of course, now if they want to work there legally, they have to pass exams in Russian so that they can get in and work. Let's come back to Russian language broadcasting in Central Asia. The ability to understand the language makes Russian programming accessible to most people in Central Asia. But the content also helps draw them to Russian programming. I'm speaking here about television. And I've watched Uzbek and Tajik television. I have nothing against seeing Dr. House dubbed into Uzbek, and I don't have anything against seeing French and Soviet movies dubbed into Tajik. But once that ends, you end up with news programs of very Soviet style, leaders visiting factories, farms. It's not exactly exciting presentations. And then you get the cultural presentations, which are absolutely fine, and I have nothing against music and dance troupes, but these things go on for hours. So if you got a chance to watch Russian television, which is fairly more dynamic than the Central Asian programming, you're probably going to do that. And people all across Central Asia still have satellite dishes, and they watch it all the time. I know, for instance, in Turkmenistan, Russian news is still one of the main sources of information out there. Okay, so I'll add one last thing on Russian language. RFARL broadcasts in Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Tajik, Turkmen, and Uzbek to Central Asia. So does the Voice of America, so does the BBC. At RFARL, we believe that broadcasting in the local language brings us a bit closer to the region. Russia doesn't even bother to do that. As far as I know, there are no broadcasts in Uzbek, Tajik, any of that come from Russian state media. It's a sign, perhaps, of how confident the Kremlin is in its ability to manipulate the media in that area. But it could work to Russia's disadvantage in the end, and I'm going to come back to that point in a minute. So what can Russia do with its soft power? Well, we already have examples from Kyrgyzstan in 2010. Russian media is still widespread in Kyrgyzstan, mainly in the north. And that was enough in early 2010 to help bring down Kurmanbek Bakiyev. Bakiyev, of course, took a large Russian loan and then decided to allow his son to make some interest by reinvesting the money. At the same time, the money was given to him because there was an understanding that he was going to shut down the American base at Manas, which he did not do, and in fact redid the deal, and ended up getting extra money from the Americans at the same time. So Russian media started blasting in reports about corruption in the Kyrgyz government and the Bakiyev family. Combined with domestic problems that Bakiyev was accumulating at that time over restructuring the government without holding a national referendum, power shortages, utility rate hikes, it wasn't surprising that the situation in northern Kyrgyzstan simply collapsed. In sports terms, Russia didn't get a goal, but they certainly got an assist on bringing him down. Later in 2010, it appeared Omurbek Tekibayev and his Atamaken party were headed toward an easy victory in parliamentary elections. Under the new post-Bakiyev constitution, Kyrgyzstan was a parliamentary government, and Atamaken's almost certain victory meant Tekibayev was looking at becoming prime minister. But Russia didn't approve of Kyrgyzstan's new constitution. Tekibayev helped draft that constitution, and nor did Moscow approve of Tekibayev. So at the end of September, with elections set for October 10th, Russia's NTV broadcast a 2-year-old video of Tekibayev and an adulterous liaison. About the same time, leaders of other Kyrgyz political parties visited Moscow to meet with Russian leaders, events that Russian media covered extremely, at least more than one would expect at the time. They gave a lot of coverage to it, and people in Kyrgyzstan, of course, saw this too. Atamaken's popularity plunged right before the poll. The party was one of 5 political parties to win seats in the new parliament, but it received the least amount of seats. The next year, when Kyrgyzstan held presidential elections, Parliament, not surprisingly perhaps, banned live broadcasting of foreign channels during the campaign, a move that pretty much everyone saw as trying to thwart Russia's efforts to do the same thing again. So that gives us an idea of the power of Russia's soft power, and it's something that's probably been on the minds of Kazakhstan's government lately when they look at their Russian population and look at what's happening in Ukraine right now. So that gives us an idea where we are today. And I'm glad now that I got a chance to talk about tomorrow, because I can address what I believe is a misperception about the future of Central Asian coverage at the same time. I've seen articles that suggest as far as the Western media is concerned, once the U.S. and other foreign troops pull out of Afghanistan, interest in Central Asia is going to plummet, and things will look more like they were in the in the 1990s, when hardly anyone paid attention to the region. I don't think that's correct at all. I was writing about Central Asia in the 1990s, and there was only one big player, outside player in the region, that was Russia, and that was Russia under Boris Yeltsin. 13 years later, 13 years after 9/11, there's more external actors present in the region now, and there's 2 major players in Central Asia, Russia and China. And there's several secondary players, Iran, Pakistan, India, the European Union, and more than likely the United States is about to drop into that secondary role too. So that's a new dynamic for the region. Afghanistan was a problem for Central Asia before 9/11. It's likely to be again in the coming years. Islam is a much more complex issue in Central Asia than it was in the 1990s, and that's going to continue for some time to come, how to treat Islam. The 2 old strongmen of Central Asia, Kazakhstan's Nursultan Nazarbayev and Islam Karimov, are in their twilight years, and when they go, we're going to witness a change in the 2 most populous countries in Central Asia. About 75% of the people in Central Asia live in those 2 countries. So Russia's soft power is going to have a huge role in the coming years in trying to spin these events into something that benefits the Kremlin. And we're already seeing that right now, the alleged threat of the Islamic State in Central Asia. Russian media has been hammering that home for weeks and weeks now, and they've not only got the leaders worried about the Islamic State, forgetting that Iran's between them and they still haven't even made it over into eastern Iraq, but even the people there are starting to get concerned that this Arab-based movement might actually show up in Central Asia. The unfortunate part about that is the real threat is in Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is right next door. And I have no doubt that when Russia wants to bring that threat up to try to manipulate opinion, that they'll probably bring that up too. It's been fairly effective for them to hype this threat because, of course, they do have military bases there in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and they're seen as the ultimate guarantor of security in Central Asia. So whether it's the Islamic State or Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan or any one of a dozen other militant or banned Islamic groups, you can be sure that Russian press is going to start bringing this up in the future, as they are right now with the Islamic State. But Russian soft power is also likely to help form Central Asian opinion about China. That, for me, that will be the interesting one because of the relationship Moscow has with China right now. Russia doesn't want too much Chinese influence in the region. At the same time, China's a major partner. So they're going to have to treat this very sensitively when they come across because they don't want China having too much influence in a region which they regard as being their own backyard. The Kremlin can be expected to exert maximum soft power when changes in leadership in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan occur. Moscow would wish to see pro-Russian leadership in both those countries. And will probably work on every level, and especially media, to try to shape public opinion in those countries. Up till now, I've made it sound like Russia has all the high cards in the region, and they certainly do have some powerful influence there. But I mentioned earlier that Russia is confident enough, or arrogant enough, to feel the need to create, not to feel the need to create special broadcasting for Central Asian languages. The Central Asian peoples are divided now, a process that's becoming more acute as we get further away from the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I remember when I was there in 1990, 92, and 93, many of the people in Central Asia actually didn't trust, they would tell me openly that they didn't trust the Kremlin, they didn't trust Russian media, because they figured that the Kremlin was trying to manipulate the information sphere there, and so they didn't really pay that much attention to what was going on. Russia might be the devil they know, but it's still the devil. So when I've noticed, when I've been doing over the course of the last more than 20 years, when crises hit the region, the people in Central Asia always turn to outside sources of information. They understand that what Russia is going to broadcast is probably that information which most benefits the Kremlin. Of course, local media is absolutely worthless because you're only going to get the government saying everything's okay and we have everything under control. Don't worry about it, be a good citizen. Some examples of how these things can change. During the Tajik Civil War, RF-ERL's Tajik service was one of the most popular and trusted sources for news. During both of Kyrgyzstan's revolution, the same was true for RF-ERL's Kyrgyz service. During the IMU incursions into southern Kyrgyzstan and eastern Uzbekistan, the same was true for the Uzbek service. And by the way, I heard from Kyrgyz refugees who had come out of the mountains in 1999 that even the Islamic movement in Uzbekistan was listening to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. So I'm not saying that just because I have a chance to indulge in some shameless self-promotion on behalf of my organization, although that works for me too. But generally speaking, people think that Western news agencies are more credible, and that becomes important when the region is experiencing hard times. It's something I've noticed, seen repeated, and found curious for years. I hesitate to say that we have to wait until there's the next crisis in Central Asia to look for a moment of opportunity for Western media, but it's certainly something that shouldn't be forgotten or overlooked because we're far from being done with hard times in Central Asia, and the most interesting times are coming in the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. With that, I think we'll open it up to questions from the floor. So if anybody wants to ask a question of the panelists, I would ask if you could please identify yourself when you ask a question.
Point about how the regime feels in the class and the fear of instability and chaos. I'm also struck at Putin's pretty adept use of history, Russian history, even Soviet. I'm thinking ahead to year 2017. Are you thinking about the 100th anniversary of the revolution? Do you think this is going to pose an interesting challenge for the media space, for Russian commentators, in terms of the frequent times that Putin seems to highlight the positive aspects of some of the need for order, psychological instability, and the great fear that you know there's that concern about unrest in the street, chaos, protesting the revolution. Have you seen the influence of the fact that people begin to think about how they're going to manage the issue of 1917?
Yeah, I think it's maybe really a very interesting challenge for one because, well, my area of expertise is mostly security services, and I try to ask them, well, when I try to understand something about their mentality today, I've always proudly told me that we are successors of Cheka, and also we are successors of Akhranka, of the secret police of the Russian Empire. And I ask them all the time, so how can you be the successors of these two organizations which actually have, well, tried to eliminate each other, and eventually Cheka succeeded. And the answer was very simple, and again it shows this simplistic approach to everything, that we are the guardians of the state, no matter what kind of state. We need to protect the regime, and that's all. But I think maybe it might go for the security services, but it cannot go for the whole of for the government, for the state, for the regime. And maybe Nabi is right as well, remarking that Putin, well, actually failed to produce any kind of future for Russia, and this kind of thing is still not very defined. So, but I think you're right. In 2017, that might be very interesting.
Please.
Hi, I'm Kathy Fitzpatrick from the Interpreter. I have a question for any or all of the panelists. There's a debate about whether Russian or English are an English language word, especially for government people and government. Do you have an opinion on whether there should be more or less programming in the Russian language so that central languages can learn by each other? And whether Russian media is useless for this world, or whether it can all be done outside?
Just for the record, I want to restate the question so we have this. Kathy was asking about the role of English and Russian, and whether Russian media should be the sole outlet, if I'm correct, or should there be more effort to broadcast in Russian from outside the region? That's correct?
Well, and whether English is really what people are learning on the internet, whether it's debate is whether it should be Russian or English, and if Russian, solely outside of Russian.
So the most effective means of communication, whether it's English or Russian?
You mean where?
In Central Asia.
Well, I think Russian.
Yeah, I think Russian.
No, you know, I mean, yes, right now, absolutely. In the 1990s, you might have had a little bit more luck with English because it was seen as the language of computers and people were learning it. But at RFARL, for instance, the Central Asian services do run a program called Crossroads, and all 5 of them dump information in. It's done in Russian, even though it's coming from the 5 different Central Asian services, so they can give a general view of what's been happening recently in Central Asia. And, you know, we have to use Russian for that one just because there's easier chance for a wider audience to be able to understand what's going on. So yeah, I would say Russian is much more effective going into Central Asia.
Yes, please.
Elise Juliana, I teach Russian politics here and work for Harvard Institute. Thank you for a very, very informative panel. 2 questions to the panelists. Mr. Abdullaev, you mentioned that there's more complex game going on with regard to the government's attitude toward the free media or the critical media, but you didn't give some specifics. Do you have something in mind there, or are you talking perhaps about the oligarchs' gains of financial interests?
Yeah, I meant exactly this. This is not just political question. It's also there is also some money in it in this market, and not that much in the print issue, but a lot of in television. And for example, there is a version that there is like within the Putin's internal circle of friends, there is like a very small group of his like previous friends and a group of so-called siloviki, and this particular decision hits the group of his former like all-time friends like Rothenberg brothers whom he knew from before becoming FSB officer, KGB officer, and that the Siloviki group will benefit from it financially. Yeah, it's quite complex. Yeah.
If I may also pose a question to Mr. Soldatov.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting comments about middle class. And I don't doubt your point about the unifying nature of the World War II net and its effect on Russian families, but quite a bit of time has passed since 1991. We need to hear we're further and further away from the number of people who were alive even during World War II. And
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you a bit about, Russia's relationship to Germany, and it doesn't seem like Russia has continued to use this kind of anti-German feeling, or even brought it up,
Absolutely, yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, maybe I need to explain. The point is that it's not, of course, it's not about what the problem is that in Russia, the victory of the Second World War is portrayed as the exclusive victory of Russia. And when you live in a country which lost the status of superpower, you need something to remember why you were so prominent. And this legacy of the Second World War is the only thing which actually reminds the Russians that they were so important, that actually they saved. The very common thing in Russia is to say that Russia actually saved Europe many times, first from Mongols, then from Napoleon, then from Germany, etc. It's not a big point with, for the relations between Russia and Germany, because we won, and we have no grievance against Germany. The problem is our relations with the United States, where the United States actually, and then we got all kinds of conspiracy theories why the United States delayed the decision to join the Allies during the war, etc., etc., etc. All this, if you now walk into the Russian bookstore, you might find, thousands of books about these things. It's such a huge thing. It's all kind of conspiracy theories. It's all kind of, and it's all based on the legacy of the Second World War. So it's still a very relevant thing even for people in the 30s and 20s, because for them it's a question of why we are so important. But we should remember the thing about this relationship with the United States specifically. The very good example is the scandal about the Russian illegals exposed to the United States in 2010. In the United States, it was portrayed as a victory, the success of FBI, because they caught the guys who actually achieved nothing. In Russia, the same guys were portrayed as heroes. And the reason was that we are back. We can send our people to the United States to live there for decades. It means that we can challenge the United States. So all these kind of feelings were exploited by the propaganda all the time.
It's also just about propaganda, if I may. It's about the top decision-making among Russian and US leadership. Most of the US-Russia relations were built on vital national interests such as non-proliferation and arms control. And all these things were put together, the accords, the disagreements, at the time when leaders remembered and feared what the nuclear war. Today, either it's ADD or there is no flying objects and no nuclear mushrooms that are being observed by the leaders, and people are not digging holes in their backyards. Leaders stopped believing that the nuclear war is possible. And that's why actually the core of the US-Russia relationship that came from the Soviet Union is no longer important. There is nothing else that kind of unites the vital interests of the two countries.
In the United States, civil society NGOs over the past 20 years have been establishing websites that cost money to keep them up, manage them, but they've become an important level of learning and shaping opinion. I don't expect anything like that exists in Russia, but I'm wondering if the most powerful, perhaps the best financed NGOs have managed to enter the social media and have a presence there at all.
I don't think so. there are huge NGOs. The biggest is Memorial, I think. But they cater to the interests of very, very limited audience, people who care or who kind of track the human rights. They do not participate in a broader public discourse, even among educated urban Russians.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I think it was a great example of the Kremlin's miscalculation, because during the protest, the Kremlin tried to portray NGOs as puppets of the West, which actually are, well, instigated this protest. And, well, the NGOs were absolutely irrelevant. Nobody from the NGOs were ever invited to go to the station to talk to crowds. They were absolutely insignificant. That was a big failure for them, because we were losing their reputation and their impact for years and for years. And it's still at a very low level. These people might be respected, but in very small, well, groups of the population.
In Siberia or in the Far East, and we have sort of regional interests. Are there any NGOs that are strong enough? I remember at the time the automobile people, remember, who worked up.
Vladivostok, yeah.
This was a particular.
No, there were like splashes of activity. That these were very local, and also they were not political. They were mainly economical interests. And as soon as the authorities managed somehow to kind of cool off the situation, cool down, they never returned. Actually, if you look at this kind of local interests and compare them to, say, Ferguson situation, things like this happen in Russia when some kind of a Chechen or Caucasus native kill a Russian somewhere in a small town in Siberia. There is a clash between diaspora, and then there is the government intervenes, but intervenes completely differently than it does here. Back there, in Russia, the aim to intervene is to cool down immediately the situation and to find a solution, to mitigate it, not just to prove that this side is right and the law should prevail. No, in this, stability should prevail. And there are a lot of political techniques and manipulation techniques that have been developed, and they work really well.
Civil society is absent from the social media. This is what I'm drawing from what you said.
No, they're present when, for example, organizations like to protect rights of prisoners, they try to be on social networks, but mostly because some of these organizations were launched by journalists, and they just know how to deal with social media, especially with Facebook.
And they have like strong surges of activity. For example, when something bad happens, like volunteers go and help people who suffered from the flood in Krasnodar region, and there was a huge drive toward it. But as soon as the disaster goes away, or there were these big wildfires in the Moscow region several years ago, there was a huge volunteer movement, but after the situation is dealt with, they disappear.
Alex?
Yeah, and we have a mic working now, so that's people who have questions also to line up and use the mic so we get you on the record. Just to follow up about social media to Andrei, but Bruce and Nabi, feel free to take it too. Could you describe the state of official efforts to politicize social media? You know, one of the trends I've noticed that even in academic research circles, I'm seeing a flood of papers on the independent effects of Facebook, for instance, you know, as a mobilizing device, and an attempt to isolate social media as a particularly dangerous, mobilizing, destabilizing type of vehicle. Do you see that too? And if so, have these efforts been relatively successful in terms of how social media itself is perceived by the Russian public?
Well, you're absolutely right. It all started in spring of 2011, mostly because of the Arab Spring, and the FSB was tasked to deal with social networks. And then I well remember they told me, my sources inside, that they don't know how to deal with Facebook because Facebook is not actually based in Russia, so they cannot use the interception techniques to find a backdoor to Facebook. They had some monitoring programs, but it was not very well effective. And when they actually, I think it's a very interesting question, because in this case we see how the traditional approach to control something clashed with technology. And I think the great example is the example of Kentucky. Kentucky was dealt with by the government this spring. Pavel Durov was expelled from Russia, and well, Kentucky now is under control of pro-government oligarchs, and a guy who is now seen as the next CEO of Kentucky is actually a son of Abdullaev, who is the chairman of All Russia Television Broadcasting Company. So it's all strictly under control. But when we got the crisis of Ukraine, enough soldiers who were posted and sent to Crimea or to Ukraine started posting their photographs and information of Kentucky, not on Facebook. And it seems that, well, management of Kentucky, we just don't know what to do with it. We got some crazy decrees by the military authorities that about all soldiers should stop their online activities. It never happened. So it seems that even when authorities know how to deal with local-based social networks, even in this particular area, we are not very successful, not to say about Facebook.
And I believe that there is a gradual shift from the strategy of kind of cutting people off from Facebook to increasing own presence on the Facebook. And a good example will be Foreign Ministry. They opened a Twitter account 6 months ago. Now they have 170,000 followers. But if you go to the Twitter account, it's mainly attacking James Saki. It's trolling, and trolling. And it works pretty well. People love it, like it, and share it. Yeah, but to which extent this influences policy? Trolling is fun to read, yeah, but it's something that you don't quote in the New York Times. And yes, there was this notion that Facebook and other social networks will allow the emergence of independent journalism and the truth will prevail. It's a very interesting case, for example, with Ukraine and Donetsk Republic and Luhansk Republic. Over 2 million people live there, and I don't see any good blogging from there. Any like enthusiast or a local journalist doing reports in social networks of what was going on there. Instead, what we see is a very intense war between Ukrainian and Russian bloggers. I don't know to which extent Russian bloggers are being paid for trolling or for posting fakes or for attacking each other. And it leads not to finding the truth, but to the situation when you just say, plug onto both of your house, I don't read this, yeah, and this is one reaction, and maybe it is, and I think it is an intended reaction. Yeah, and the second is that whenever something really truthful may appear, it's being blanketed by so much lies and fakes, so that you don't recognize real true reporting in the big amount of fakes. For example, when there was this plane accident, when the plane was shot down, so many wild theories were thrown into the social networks and turned viral, including that it was aliens to be blamed for this. Yes, that whatever plausible version of it could have appeared there, it would not be noticed, or it would be considered along with a huge number of really wild and stupid ones.
Well, if I could just throw in too that as regards Central Asia, they've taken the Chinese model instead, where they're trying to develop their own sites. That Uzbekistan and Tajikistan are two of them. In fact, Uzbekistan will preach that these Facebook and things like that are part of this evil Western influence, but they don't really make that much of a distinction between the Russian and the English ones. They're trying to develop their own internal social networking sites that they can monitor, of course, much more easily. But I've always been struck by the fact that they seem to consider the Russian social networking sites as much of a threat, potentially, as the Facebook site. And Tajikistan, of course, has regularly shut down both the Russian and the English social networking sites at the same time. So they're afraid of the messages that get passed both in English and in Russian.
Can you please hear? Hold on, use my, thank you.
I
I'd be interested to hear more about media coverage in Russia of Eastern Ukraine, in particular the politics of what's going on within the DNR and the LNR. There's been a big fight between Borodai and Stelkov that's been extensively reported in Russia. And I'm curious as to why that's being reported in the Russian press. Who is pushing this story of kind of the conflict within the DNR, and what's the background as to why that's actually made the news? I'm Chris Miller from Yale University.
Well, I think that this story is not being reported in details. People have very vague understanding of the internal power dynamics in these places. And they get the broader picture from television. 95% of the Russians get their news from television. And television kind of speaks what's the most interesting things or most plausible or like most useful thing for the Kremlin at the moment, and omits questioning why these things happen. There was, for example, the very fast rotation of actors in like key actors in the Donetsk events. There was this Girkin guy, and then there was this Kharchenko, then the Borodai. They are disappearing, and then they just disappear from the public radar. Although sometimes they try to, like Girkin. Girkin is absolutely kind of desperado. Yeah, he's not afraid of anything, and he goes out and talks to anyone. He's a media pet. Yeah, but television doesn't question what was the role of that guy who was sent there by Moscow, became like prime minister, and then disappeared, and was replaced by another guy.
Yeah, I think Nabi is absolutely right.
Sorry. Nate Schenken from Freedom House. I wanted to go back to the framing of the panel about a Eurasian media space and to this question of whether there is a Eurasian media space or whether it's a series of country spaces, national spaces, or maybe a Central Asian space and a Russian space. And in particular to ask about the new efforts that seem to be coming out of the new RIA Novosti, out of Rossiya Сегодня, under which we're seeing the development of Russia-directed national services, and in particular the hiring of local journalists from independent outlets in some of these countries. So if you have anything to say about that, I'd be interested to hear it, whether Russia is capable of creating a coherent media space and whether that is its goal.
You know, as far as Central Asia, I think it's already been created and it's there. You know, they're adding to it all the time, but as long as I've been traveling through there, I regularly see Russian television on there, and people in cars I'm in are listening to Russian radio, so it never went away. They're constantly refining it, and I would expect that process will continue, probably even be speeded up in the coming years, but you know, I mean, it's the lingua franca. So it's very easy for them. They know they have an audience there, and they will have.
Okay.
I was just going to, again, Kathy Fitzpatrick from The Interpreter, just to comment on you made an interesting point that you didn't think there was blogging and social media from the Donbass. And I would agree that, you know, you don't have like a Navalny or those kinds of figures, but what you do have are YouTube channels, and those are really thriving. All the separatist leaders have their own film crews. They constantly put up videos, Motorola.
They do. I'm speaking about civil
of
journalism, like people, independent journalism or independent enthusiasts reporting what they see, not the propaganda efforts. Of course.
No, I realize. But I think there are some, you know, you'll find some critical citizen journalists and just ordinary people. But also, I just was wondering what you think of the use of the internet by the different cities. I mean, not in Donbass, but also other provincial cities in Russia. The cities themselves run websites, and some of them seem interesting and have, you know, useful news. I just wonder if you've ever analyzed that sector.
I'm afraid I didn't understand the question. What
cities,
do...
you know, like the Warsaw, those kinds of places.
even in Ukraine or in Russia? Both. Well, I'm not very familiar with old city sites of Ukraine. I might say that maybe the only example, the very good example of a city site was the story of Sochi, because but during the Olympics, the blog on Sochi was really a very good source of information. We actually published the news about this would-be suicide bombings in Sochi before the Olympics, and this information was obviously the authorities were not very happy with this information, but this blog was the first source to publish this information, and then it was confirmed by independent and international journalists. But I think it's one of the very few examples of real good civil journalism in regions, because to be frank, if we are talking about, say, regional media, maybe the North Caucasus is the only example, and maybe in Novosibirsk, where you can find strong independent media. For most of the central Russia, it's not the case.
I actually have a question. Now, Nabi, you mentioned that Putin has no positive vision. It's basically just an anti-Western vision. And Andrei, you mentioned that there's a vast pool of resentment that he tapped into. Given what's happening in Russia right now, especially with the crash of the ruble and the economy threatening to go into a serious recession, and now because of sanctions in part and the crash of the oil prices, how long can the existing situation last? What are the limits of the Russian population's patience? How long will they buy current arguments before they say, hey, wait, something's got to give? Or could this go on for a long, long time?
I think it could long for a long time, because you need to understand that like each Russian is making his own cost-benefit analysis and what he can do. I mean, okay, fine, you are getting poorer and poorer, you are losing money, losing jobs, but if you take to the streets with all the draconian laws adopted recently, that you will be really fine. You can go to jail for 1 year if you just go out on the street without permit. Yeah. And the thing is also that over 15 years of his own rule, Putin has cleaned up the political landscape. There is no any visible alternative to Putin there. And there is this Navalny guy, but his appeal is very limited, and it's like within Moscow, and he's not known outside Moscow and not popular there. And even in Moscow, his main support group, which are like pro-Western liberals, were appalled by his latest nationalistic rhetoric. So the thing is, if there would be in Russia some kind of alternative, or a leader offering an alternative to Putin, but there is no such one. And that's why I believe that the current situation can last for years, maybe decades.
I should agree. I think that the problem is that first we don't have alternative not only in terms of a leader, but also in terms of ideas. Because even the opposition leaders, they exploited the idea of nationalism, and of course Putin in this field played much better, because he might propose not only the idea of getting rid of migrants, but, well, of grabbing some land in Ukraine, but this appeal is much, well, more interesting. And also the problem is that, given this level of political culture, what kind of alternative might be developed by, well, if we are talking about the same middle classes? If they were able to produce only these nationalistic ideas in the mid of 2000s, when relatively the economic situation was much better. Also, we need to remember one thing about the economy, that maybe over the last 3-4 years, the military-industrial complex again became much more stronger. Now, according to Putin's estimates, in his own words, it was something about 2 million people engaged in the military-industrial complex. It means that engineers, so technical intelligence, again, became very loyal to the state, to the government, and it's a very strong thing because it's also partly based on the education system. It's based on their traditions because technical intelligentsia in Russia was always very loyal and very close to the military-industrial complex and to security services. And now we got some funding, and the funding was generous. The problem is that even sanctions now, they actually help the military-industrial complex because some big companies like Siemens, they lost their military contracts in Russia. So the Russian companies got this money, and for a while this situation might last for some maybe 3 years, maybe 4 years. Well, hopefully it will be just 2 years, but there's no answer.
Yes, just quickly, my name is Diane Wildman. I'm a journalist in Connecticut. My question is for Bruce Pannier. I'm fascinated by your long history in the region and how you personally have observed so many changes. And I was wondering if, first of all, where you live right now.
I'm in Prague.
Okay. And in places where you've traveled and covered, how has the expat story changed there? Because really, some of the influence that you might wield goes beyond your microphone and your job to your own personal presence in people's lives and those like you, other Westerners. And how has that changed over the years for you?
Well, I mean, if you want to go back to the start, in 1992, I had practically unlimited access. I could just cross any border and go almost anywhere I wanted. And I did regularly. There's many more restrictions on that now, so that's one thing. I'm essentially blacklisted in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. I can't get in there at all anymore. So that's a problem. In the meantime, it's not just me, my own personal experience, but at the start there weren't that many Westerners that had ever come to Central Asia. So people are curious like everybody else. And so they were much more accepting. Maybe they didn't agree with everything that I said, but at least they wanted to hear what I had to say. They having heard for years and years into the Soviet Union about the evil Western influence, I guess they wanted to see if that was true or not. They've become more accustomed to foreigners now, obviously. I was discussing this yesterday, that this dream of democracy and stuff, and during the 1990s when people didn't know very much about democracy, then they were willing to listen and give everything a shot. Their governments have so perverted, is the only way I can say that, the concept of democracy, that this is what they think is true democracy out there. And I've had long discussions with people about, democracy's done, it's dead here, we tried it, it didn't work. And I try to make the point that you never had it to begin with, and your government has just, side-railed the whole process, but they've really had enough with that kind of stuff. And moving to kind of a slightly different example, you would have thought that with Manas base and Americans being there, it would have helped a lot to, to get not necessarily influence, but get the people more accustomed to having Americans around and get a little more cultural understanding. But actually, the exact opposite happened. By the time the Americans got out of the base, the popularity rating for having certainly American troops in the country is just way down. Everyone almost wanted them out. So it's it's limited contact, it's limited ability to get around, and then what their governments are saying and what a lot of people remember from the Soviet Union, is coming back to the fore. And one last example, because I don't want to harp on this, but when Bakiev was on the run and he was down in the south, I went there and people could see that I wasn't from there. I was in Jalalabad. And they'd come up and they'd say, is it true that American commandos are coming down here to kidnap him and take him away? And I said, that's absurd. Why would we have any interest? And people were willing to accept that was my answer, but I could see they didn't believe what I was saying. And they also didn't believe we would leave the Manas base. I said, sure, when we're done, we'll go. And one guy even said, he goes, Americans never leave American military bases unless they're thrown out of the country. And I tried to make the point, what's our interest? If we're not in Afghanistan, why would we stay? And, so sadly, that's kind of it. It was much easier in the 90s. People were much more accepting. But that, I guess the mystique has faded away now.
Our last questioner.
My name is Casey Michelle. I'm a student here at the Harriman Institute, so thank you very much for this presentation today. I'm looking forward to the second one in a little bit. There was a report that came out a few weeks ago from a group called Privacy International detailing the means with which Central Asian governments digitally survey their populaces, focusing especially on Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And Mr. Soldatov, I was hoping to address a question to you, given your past expertise in research. I was wondering if you may be able to touch on the similarities or divergences between the Russian digital surveillance mechanisms, especially the SORM network, and those employed in Central Asia, or divergences.
Yeah, because we've been working with Privacy International on this issue for 2 or 3 years. So that's a very good question. Well, the problem is that when we try to understand the similarities or differences between the system, the first thing we found is that the terminology in legislation is almost identical. SORM is everywhere. You can find SORM in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, in Tajikistan, in Kyrgyzstan, and it's a very common thing. The problem is that even the titles of departments responsible for communication interception are still the same. So the problem is that the Soviet KGB developed this kind of terminology in the 60s, and most of its countries they still stick to this terminology. By chance, only the FSB actually changes the name. All of the countries decided to maintain this terminology, and in some of the countries like Kazakhstan, they literally copied Russian legislation on communication interception. It means one thing. It means that technically the Russian system of communication interception and the Western system of telecommunication interception are different. And it means that to make it work, you need to buy some stuff in Russia, because this kind of stuff are not produced in the West. I don't want to go into details. If you want, I can explain these things. But there are some special devices which actually turns your black box, which is installed on premises of communication interception, into a backdoor which might be distantly, remotely manned by the security service. This kind of thing produced only in Russia. And it means that in many of these countries, internet service providers or telecom operators, if they want to comply with the legislation which is copied after Russian, they need to buy these things, and they need also to invite Russian expertise how to use these things. But of course there are some interesting exceptions, and the most interesting exception is Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan copied some legislation from Russia, they buy some stuff in Russia, but at the same time, when they need to train the guys in surveillance, they send these guys to Quantica, to the United States. And if they need to do something on social networks, they know pretty well that Russian systems of monitoring social networks are not very effective. It's mostly because of the problems with databases. So they buy this system in Israel. So Uzbekistan might be the best example of the authoritarian, totalitarian state which was able to combine all three approaches. So the most advanced Western technology, the most intrusive Russian legislation, and to make it work.
Well, thank you very much for the interesting question and answer and presentation session here. That concludes the first panel of today's event, and we'll break for coffee, and we'd like to reconvene at 11:10 promptly. Thank you.